Our scripture reading for this morning is taken from the New Testament, 2 verses, one from Matthew and one from Luke. Matthew 6, verse 11. Give us this day our daily bread. 11:3. Give us each day our daily bread. And so ends God's words. Our message this morning, God's manna. Pastor Don Smith.
Not really lost any weight, or if you're not feeling bad, so Cecily thinks you're eating
short portion of what we call the Lord's Prayer. I want you to notice that it begins with a command or a request, but we are asking God for something specific. Give us the bread we have coming for today. And it's important that we see the each day or this day as a part of the prayer, because God doesn't necessarily owe us what we want, but we have a right to ask God for what we need. And along that line, I want us to think about a few places in the Old Testament and the New Testament where God reinforces this idea. The sermon title is about the manna. And when we gather at the table, one of the things we remember when we distribute the bread is that God provided bread, or God provided food for Israel as they wandered through the wilderness. And they were a band that complained all the time because they were used to having plenty when they were in Egypt.
Oh, no. I'll know on the 8th what day they scheduled me. So that's not. Oh, no. If I were going in.
We actually need, because God will provide what we need. And it's a measure of our faith as to whether we trust God enough to do it God's way. Well, Israel got through part of the wilderness, and then later on, God gave instructions to Israel about something else called the Jubilee. How many of you have heard of the Jubilee? One. Okay. And that's true. That's pretty much the way it is. The people of Israel, according to the seminary professors I had, there's no evidence that the commandment God gave them while they were in the wilderness was ever carried out. And this is what the Jubilee idea was. God said, when you get to the land I will bring you to, and I give you your inheritance of land, and I take that land away from other people to give to you, It will be yours forever. You can't sell it to somebody else so that it goes out of your ownership. You can rent it to somebody else for up to 50 years. But the year of Jubilee is the year when all the people who've been using land that belong to somebody else gives it up. And people go back and take their land back into their possession. And so if you're going to deal with somebody because you have need or something and you want to get a payment for your land, you calculate the number of years it will be before the next Jubilee, and they can pay you that. But once the year of Jubilee arrives, you get your land back. Now, I happened to run into that principle when I was down in Santa Ana. The Church of Santa Ana was given a legacy in a piece of property that was 2 miles from Disneyland in Garden Grove. And while I was there, a provision of this gift came into effect. It had been 35 years, and the gift proposed that after 35 years, the land was to be reassessed, and the payment by the leaseholder who had the land for a trailer park would have to pay according to the assessment. For these 35 years, the First Presbyterian Church in Santa Ana had received $16,000 a year from the leaseholder. The agreement that was agreed to was that for 10 years, they would receive $80,000 based on the new assessment. The second 10 years, they would receive $130,000 a year. And the third 10 years that were left in the provision of the will, they would receive $330,000 a year. At the end of the 30 years, the property would revert to the ownership of the people to whom it had been left, which included the First Presbyterian Church, Santa Ana. The leaseholder over the years had been trying to buy up portions that had been given to the Salvation Army and to other groups. So they owned a majority of the property, but the First Presbyterian Church of Santa Ana still had a 30% interest in that property. So at the end of 30 years, it would revert, which was the idea of Jubilee. I had never run into that before, but at least in that one instance, the principle God had given Israel was acted out. What the other example? Oh, another example of that. No, I'm confusing two things. But we have Jesus feeding the 5,000. Now that you may think that that's not an example of this provision, but it really is. The disciples come to Jesus after he's been preaching for a few hours. And they say to Jesus, we need to send folks back to get some food because everybody's going to be hungry. And Jesus says, feed them yourself. And, they said, well, we don't have any food. Well, Jesus said, ask. And this boy gives up, or the child gives up the loaves and the fish. And so Jesus prays over that food and asks God to bless it. And they pass it around and they end up with more than they started with. Now, there are two ways you can look at this story. You can look at it as if the food multiplied as it was passed from person to person, although the story doesn't claim that at all. But the other possibility is that people brought food intending to eat it for themselves. And when the food was passed by a generous child, everybody decided to share. And when the plates came back, there was more food than they started with because people had brought enough food to really share with everybody. which was what Jesus may have been wanting to demonstrate. That that's the way the kingdom of God is supposed to operate. I remember when I was in my first parish, or no, it wasn't my first parish, over in Tracy. The women there tell a story that one day they had this dinner, potluck, and a whole bunch of people showed up they weren't expecting. And they were worried sick that they wouldn't have enough food. And by the end of the meal, they had food left over. And they said, well, you know, this was a gift. This was a miracle for them because people had cared about each other enough to make sure that everyone had enough food. That's what Paul talks about in Corinthians. He scolds the Corinthians because every time they have a meal at the table, people who bring lots of food rush to the table so they can eat it all up before the people who don't have enough get there to share it. That the whole idea of the gospel is for us to think about each other, to care about each other, to share enough so that in God's kingdom, nobody is without. Now, the fact that the Jubilee never occurred is an indication that we, as human beings, just have a hard time accepting God's principle of being satisfied with having enough. In fact, this made me think about Governor Pat Brown the first time he was governor. Do you remember? He had been instructed by the Franciscans. Oh no, the Jesuits. And one of the principles that he had as governor was the principle of enough. You remember that? He said it was enough to have enough for the need, and that the state didn't need to accumulate and people didn't need to worry about accumulating because it was all unnecessary in a place where people love and care for each other. Now, the second place where this applies, this principle, is outside the economic sharing, but it has to do with our understanding of who we are as individuals within the gathering of people. And so I was looking through some books the other day, and I wrote down some things that I came across. From 1 Corinthians 12, indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, that would make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. And our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. Whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. And then I ran across an author that I studied in other places. His name is Gary Wills, and Gary is spelled with 2 R's. And his book, Inventing America. He's a historian as well as a theologian. He writes what Jesus meant is one book, what Paul meant is another one. This from this book, Inventing America, page 301, we have this description of the morality discussion that took place during the Revolutionary War and the forming of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, many strands of moral sense thought come together here to show how far Jefferson was from the belief that the individual is atomistic in a Lockean state of nature. Reed's belief that all good sense is a common sense is fully human only in groups. Smith's belief that morality arises only from sympathy with others. Hutcheson's belief that language and thought arise together, etc. And then this famous quote, no man is an island, entire of itself. Every person is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. By John Donne. No man is an island. You see, when God created us and created two, he meant for us to be in relationship with all the rest. When Jesus taught about our treasure, he warned us not to put our treasure in earth, but in heaven, where moth and rust and thieves cannot break in and steal or rot what we have. To think in terms of everyone and not just ourselves. To have the value of not what we have, but what all of humans have, and how we can share and love and care for each other in meaningful ways. Give us today our daily bread, so that the other bread can be shared with everyone else in an equal amount, so that all can have their care and all live a full and abundant life, sharing it together.